I married Ethan when I was 23. He was cold by nature. Our marriage was nothing more than a convenient arrangement. He chose me because I was obedient enough to appease his family. Everyone knew he already had his one and only, Sophia. And when she returned, it would only be a matter of time before I had to vacate the position of Mrs. Joe. Eventually, she did come back. Knowing my place, I proposed a divorce. He gave a casual smile, utterly indifferent. Fine, let's divorce then. After that day, we barely spoke, until the news of my engagement spread. That same evening, he called me 13 times. The first call contained just 2 words, congratulations. By the 13th, I had lost my patience. What is it you want to say? He bit down on his cigarette, his voice muffled and hoarse. Is he richer than me? Better to you than I was? Is that why you're marrying him? #1 When I saw Sophia's divorce announcement on her social media, I knew my marriage with Ethan was as good as over. Of course, it wasn't just me who knew. It was obvious to everyone. Under that post, I saw a flood of comments. Ethan's friends, classmates, business partners. They all chimed in. Sophia, congrats on being single again. When are you coming back? Exactly. Someone's been waiting for you forever. These same people were always distant with me. Whenever Ethan brought me to social gatherings, they would politely call me sis-in-law. But after that, they'd look away, avoiding any further interaction. Yet, occasionally, our eyes would meet, and I could see it clearly: pity. Yes, pity. In movies and stories, who doesn't love to see star-crossed lovers reunited in the end? Life already has enough disappointment and heartbreak. Ethan and Sophia were precisely that kind of idyllic couple. They grew up together, went to school together, and naturally fell in love. Everyone assumed they would marry someday if Sophia hadn't gone abroad and married someone else. I'd seen photos of them together back when I was visiting Ethan's mother, Victoria. Sophia was stunning, her skin smooth and porcelain-like. She stood beside Ethan, playful and bright, her eyes brimming with joy. Anyone who saw them would agree they were a perfect match. Victoria sighed as she showed me the photo. Sophia, I don't know what she was thinking, marrying someone overseas just like that. Poor Ethan. She stopped herself there, but I knew what she meant. Poor Ethan, losing the love of his life, only to settle for someone like me. To him, she was the one who got away, a healed scar that still left a faint ache when remembered. She was the one they had watched him fight for, get jealous over, grieve for, only for it all to end in heartbreak. Compared to that, what was I? Not that Ethan ever treated me poorly. He was always composed and well-mannered. Wherever we went, he gave me all the respect that came with being Mrs. Joe. When we visited the old family estate for dinner, he would hold my hand afterward and walk with me through the garden. If I twisted my ankle, he'd crouch down, turn his back to me, and tilt his head slightly under the moonlight, his voice unexpectedly soft. Get on. I often stayed up late working, and he'd appear with a glass of milk, lounging against the wall with lazy ease as he tapped my desk lightly. Hurry up and finish it. I still need to wash the glass. He was always in control, never losing his composure in front of me. Even in our most intimate moments, when his eyes reddened at the edges, he would simply smile faintly and whisper my name as if conceding something, his tone as detached as ever. Olivia, this is fine for us, isn't it? His first love was now someone else's wife, and I was his. So he said to me, this will do. #2, I scrolled through the comments under Sophia's post one by one, until I saw someone mention me, albeit unintentionally. Wait a second, isn't Ethan planning a 3-year anniversary surprise for her? You know, for his wife. The comment was deleted less than a minute later, likely because the poster realized they had overstepped. but I had already seen it. My hand hovered stiffly over the screen. 3 years. Had Ethan really planned a surprise for me? I barely had time to process this thought before I noticed Ethan had liked Sophia's post. He didn't comment, didn't say a single word, but it was precisely this silence that left so much room for interpretation. I opened my own social media. I was the kind of person who loved to share bits of my life, small moments, daily musings, little joys. I scrolled all the way back through my feed, and there wasn't a single trace of Ethan. He was someone who hated complications, who never cared for these things. I sighed, a strange sense of finality settling over me. Love, or the lack of it was all too clear. But what could I do? When we first met through a matchmaking arrangement, I had already agreed to the terms. He'd save the Shen family from bankruptcy, and I'd marry him. It was, perhaps, a matter of mutual needs. Now Sophia was coming back. Perhaps it was time for me to have an honest conversation with Ethan. If he wanted a divorce, I wouldn't oppose it. Even though, deep down, I truly loved him. After making that decision, I calmly found Ethan's number and dialed. He picked up quickly. Before I could say a word, he chuckled lightly, his tone as casual as ever. "Olivia, are you home? I'm heading back soon. Do you need me to pick anything up?" He always liked calling me by my full name, as if savoring the sound. I clenched my palm briefly, then replied in an even voice, "No need. There's just something I'd like to talk to you about." Perhaps my tone had been too serious because his voice faltered and the smile in it faded. "Is it important?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "very important." After that call, I sat quietly in the living room, waiting for him. In those brief 10 minutes, my mind wandered to so many places. I remembered the day after our wedding, when I received a friend request on social media from Sophia. She introduced herself as Ethan's childhood friend, someone who had grown up with him, but was now living abroad and hadn't been able to attend our wedding. She wanted to congratulate me on our marriage. She apologized for not being there. Back then, I had no idea she was Ethan's first love, the one he could never quite let go of. I had replied politely, thanking her. It wasn't until later, when I learned of her true identity, that I realized how oblivious I had been. But for some inexplicable reason, I didn't delete her. Nor did I tell anyone about it. Maybe it was because I didn't love Ethan at the time. People have a natural fascination with drama, and I simply observed the situation from the sidelines, curious to see what Sophia would do next. But as it turned out, she didn't do anything. Instead, my relationship with Ethan grew closer and closer. Often, I wondered if what Ethan appreciated about me was my compliance and silence. But beyond that, there was nothing more. He was no longer the young man he once was. He would never love me the way he had loved Sophia. That night, I neither saw Ethan come home nor received a text or call from him. I made several attempts to reach him, but none of my calls were answered. Holding my phone and staring at his name in the contact list, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. An unsettling premonition crept into my heart. I wasn't going to see him tonight. When two people reunite, someone else is bound to lose. Life is unpredictable like that. It always has been. I sat there dazed for a long time before finally sending him a message. "If you're busy, don't worry about coming back. I'll go to bed first." At 3 a.m, he replied with a single word, "Okay." That night, I woke up several times. I didn't sleep well. The next day, I came down with a fever. I took some medicine and slept for hours. When I woke up, it was already evening. Ethan still hadn't returned, and so another 2 days passed. The day I finally recovered, I saw a post on Sophia's social media that explained everything. It turned out that on the night I had been waiting for Ethan, Sophia had been in a car accident on the other side of the ocean. Ethan had taken the earliest flight out to be with her. These past few days, he had been by her side, taking care of her. He simply hadn't had the time to think about me. That evening, I stood alone outside our house. The road ahead was empty. No sign of Ethan. The night was clear, and the moonlight painted a thin layer of mist over my eyes. I sighed. There was no longer any need to ask Ethan about the divorce. He had already given me his answer in another way. I called my mother. When she picked up, I said only 2 sentences before she sighed. You were never a good match for the Joe family. Marrying into their world was always a stretch. Maybe it's better this way. Then she tried to comfort me. Ethan always seemed polite and approachable, but deep down, he's cold. People like him don't know how to love. But that wasn't true. I had heard stories of how he had loved Sophia in their younger years. Stories of how he had wanted to give her the best of everything. He had cherished her, protected her, and dreaded the thought of her ever being wronged. But Ethan and I, we really weren't a match. He was the kind of man raised in privilege, thriving in every aspect of life, achieving success with ease, and always having the best of everything. The only thing that hadn't gone perfectly for him was his marriage. After Sophia's wedding, Ethan had been pressured by his family to start meeting potential matches. The Joe family, torn between pitying his lost love and worrying that he might become too consumed by heartbreak, decided to intervene. During that time, a parade of women was introduced to him, daughters of wealthy families, socialites, debutantes. The sheer number was dizzying, and yet, in the end, he chose me. One of his friends, who happened to be my senior in college, had casually mentioned me. I have a junior, really pretty, though her family's background isn't great. She has a sweet temperament, very easygoing. But it's a shame her family's going through some tough times, almost bankrupt. Ethan, do you remember her? Last spring, she came to my birthday party, and I even asked her to bring you a bowl of hangover soup. Ethan was unusually quiet during that time. Even when he went out, he seemed lethargic and barely spoke. No one expected him to react to this comment, but unexpectedly, he did. His voice was low and steady. Set me up with her. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Wait, Ethan, you want to meet my junior? Ethan smiled back then, his tone brimming with intrigue. Yeah. Over the years, there were always people who felt indignant about it. They thought Ethan had married too hastily, that I wasn't good enough for him. They'd openly or subtly bring up the woman who once stood beside Ethan, the one who had been hailed as his perfect match, his golden girl. If Sophia was the moon high in the sky, then I was the dirt beneath his feet. Ethan could step on me, and the people around him would eagerly offer him a new pair of shoes. Ethan returned home the day I was packing my things. He stepped through the door, carrying the chill of the wind and frost with him. His features bore the marks of exhaustion. Rubbing his temple, he walked into the living room and started to speak. Sorry, things have been hectic lately. I haven't been able to. His voice trailed off when he noticed the scene before him. I paused mid-action. I haven't finished packing yet. It's a bit messy right now. Have a seat, give me a moment, and I'll be done soon. He stood still, unmoving. After a long moment, he looked me up and down, almost dazed, and asked, Are you going on a business trip? No, a vacation. His voice trembled slightly. I sighed, just about to answer when he seemed to realize something. A cold laugh escaped his lips, and his gaze sharpened. Standing tall, he spoke with an air of condescension. What's this? Not a business trip, not a vacation, making such a big fuss. Don't tell me you're thinking about divorcing me. In all the years we'd been married, I had never seen this side of Ethan, so sharp, so confrontational. Meeting his gaze, I nodded. Yes, we're getting a divorce. His lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at the luggage beside me. You're not joking. Before we got married, he told me that if I ever grew tired of this relationship, I could end it anytime. I nodded again. I'm not joking. Under the warm glow of the lamp, he fell silent. After a long while, he finally spoke. Give me a reason. I gripped the handle of my suitcase, unsure of where to start. He sat down, his demeanor calm, as if he had all the patience in the world. Can't think of one? That's fine. It's a long night, take your time. I've got plenty of it. His expression was steady, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed him. It was clear he hadn't had a good night's sleep in a long time. I took a deep breath, ready to speak. But then there was a knock at the door. It was the driver I had arranged. I went to open the door and told him, I'll be right out. Turning back, I glanced at Ethan. Whatever I had been about to say, I swallowed it back down. After all, he had helped me back then. And as for him and Sophia, I had never been a part of that story. Now that I had decided to let him go, what was the point in saying more? It's simple, really. It's been 3 years, and I'm tired of it. He froze for a moment, his brows furrowing as he looked at me. I placed the divorce papers on the table in front of him and walked toward the door. Just as I was stepping out, I heard his voice behind me. It carried a hint of self-mockery, as though he didn't care at all. Fine, let's divorce. Ethan and I had a prenuptial agreement. I was the one who insisted on it, as if I'd always known this day would come. We'd agreed that, when we parted ways, I wouldn't take anything from him, but when the time finally came, he was unexpectedly generous. He had his lawyer draft a new agreement, giving me half of his properties and a considerable sum of money. These are yours, he said. If you don't take them, we can just drag this out. He said this while we sat across from each other. His fingers tapped on the document as he looked up at me, his gaze carrying an odd sense of confrontation. For a moment, I thought, maybe he didn't actually want a divorce, but that thought vanished as quickly as it came. The next second, his phone rang. I saw the name on the screen, Sophia. His expression shifted, a mix of irritation and relief, as he quickly stood and walked to the balcony to take the call. See, no matter how busy someone is, they'll always have time to answer a call. But why? Why was it that day, when I waited and waited, all I got was an indifferent good? I watched his back as I picked up the pen and signed my name. Once I'd finished, I didn't wait for him to end his call. I left. The day we collected our divorce certificates, he sat in the car, staring at me with an unreadable expression. Olivia, is this really what you want? No regrets. I said yes. Ethan curved his lips into a faint smile, his grip tightening imperceptibly on the steering wheel. He glanced sideways, but avoided meeting my eyes. All right then, I'll go. I took a step back, nodding at him. Goodbye. He didn't look back at me. The next moment, his car sped past, the cold air brushing against me. Not long after, news of my divorce from Ethan spread like wildfire. I heard that on what would have been our 3rd wedding anniversary, a group of his friends showed up at his place, carrying gifts, ready to celebrate. They thought they were walking into a warm, prearranged surprise. Instead, they found nothing but Ethan himself, dressed in pajamas, his face devoid of any expression. One of them awkwardly broke the silence. Ethan, didn't you give us a heads up? You said you were planning something special for Olivia. Ethan stared at them for a long moment before curving his lips into a faint, almost bitter smile. Oh, right, forgot. Why don't you all head back? No need for this anymore. Someone instinctively asked, why not? Ethan's hand rested on the doorknob, his gaze turning cold, as if recalling something unpleasant. Why else? We're divorced. And just like that, everyone knew it was over between Ethan and me. But beyond that, Ethan had nothing more to say. When his friends couldn't pry anything out of him, they turned their questions toward me. Their words carried a veneer of sympathy, but their tones still betrayed an air of condescension. I didn't respond. I pretended not to see their messages and deleted their contacts, including Sophia's. From this point on, whatever happened between them was none of my concern. Ethan and I were never truly from the same world to begin with. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of relief. Over the years, aside from the substantial sum Ethan gave me when we got married, there was little entanglement between the Joe and Chu families. At the end of the month, I went on a business trip. While waiting in the airport terminal, I saw Ethan. He was there to pick someone up. Across the bustling crowd, across 3 years of separation, I finally saw Sophia. Standing next to him, she looked every bit the part of his perfect match. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at them. Just then, my name echoed over the airport speakers. It was time to board my flight. As I turned to leave, I noticed Ethan suddenly stop in his tracks. He looked back, scanning the crowd for a long while before finally dropping his gaze. When the plane landed, I turned on my phone and saw a message. It was from Ethan. He asked, "It was you, wasn't it?" The day I returned to North City, I hadn't been home long before another client meeting came up. I arrived at the agreed location, and by the time we wrapped up the details, it was nearly dark. As I stepped out of the private room, I spotted someone I hadn't expected to see. It was Sophia. She was holding her phone, her face lit with a radiant smile as she chatted on a call. "Yes, I'm back in the country. Don't worry, this time I'll make it work. Isn't it funny? I got divorced, and then Ethan got divorced right after me. He must still have feelings for me, right?" Standing nearby, I couldn't help but nod to myself. Yes, he does. Feelings from youth aren't so easily cast aside. I walked forward, brushing past Sophia just as she ended her call. She glanced at me briefly. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" "No," I replied. She nodded politely and didn't press further. But the very next moment, my path was blocked. I looked up to see the sharp outline of a man's jawline. Ethan stood there, looking down at me. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, and after a moment, he spoke as though it didn't mean much. "What are you doing here?" The question came out of nowhere, but I understood. He probably thought I had come here because I knew he would be here. I stayed silent for a beat, then explained. "A client wanted to meet here. We were discussing a project." Ethan's expression stiffened slightly. After a moment, he awkwardly cleared his throat. "All right, you heading home? I'll drive you." I glanced behind me. Sophia was standing not far away, watching us intently. I held up my phone. "No need, you've got company. I've already called a car, it'll be here any minute." With that, I brushed past him and walked toward the exit. But suddenly, he grabbed my wrist. His lips pressed into a tight line, and he said in a low voice, "Wait. I have something to ask you." I looked up at him. "What is it?" His eyes bore into mine, unblinking, though his grip on my wrist loosened slightly, as if afraid of hurting me. "What you said that day, it wasn't true, was it?" I froze for a moment. Then it dawned on me. He was talking about the words I had once said. "I'm tired of this." So what if it wasn't? We're divorced now. With that, I shook off his hand and walked away. It was only later that I found out that night. They were hosting a welcome back party for Sophia. But after seeing me, everything changed. Ethan's interest seemed to dissipate inexplicably. After sitting for just a short while, he made an excuse to leave. The sun rose and set as usual, Yet I never anticipated that Ethan and I wouldn't cross paths again for a long time. At the end of the month, I received an opportunity to go abroad for an exchange program. On my second day in a foreign country, while strolling down the street, I lost both my phone and wallet. I got a new phone number and registered for a new social media account. That night, at 5 in the morning, I woke up abruptly from my sleep. When I opened my phone, the first thing I saw was a photo of Sophia walking out of Ethan's company building. Netizens had dug up her connection to Ethan, along with videos and photos of her winning prestigious awards in the dance world over the years. Soon, the online chatter was abuzz with speculation about their rekindled romance, fans eagerly shipping them as the perfect, broken mirror, mended couple. As I read through the comments, I noticed someone had mentioned me. I heard Ethan was married before, is that true? Shortly after, someone replied, I have a friend in their circle. Apparently, they're divorced now. No feelings were involved, and it ended cleanly. I paused for a moment, staring at the screen. Memories of the 3 years Ethan and I spent together surfaced. Not once during that time had anyone truly blessed our relationship or believed we'd last. A few days later, I received a call from Emma, my friend. She told me, Ethan's been going crazy trying to find you these past few days. He says he can't reach your number. He doesn't know you left. I thought for a moment before asking, did he say why he's looking for me? Emma sighed. He didn't say. If Ethan really wanted my new number, it wouldn't have been hard for him to get it. But after that day, I didn't receive any calls from him. When the first snow of the year fell, I stood by my window, looking down at the street below. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a familiar figure. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. Since moving here, I'd kept in touch with only a handful of people. And in our conversations, Ethan's name never came up. Occasionally, I'd wonder if he was married by now to someone he truly loved. 2 years flew by. When I returned to the country, it coincided with my best friend's engagement. She called me and asked me to go wedding dress shopping with her. I agreed. What I didn't expect was to run into Ethan. Across the street, he stood beside his car, looking down at his phone. He didn't notice me. In the 2 years since I last saw him, he seemed to have grown colder, his entire demeanor exuding a distant and restrained aura that made him seem unapproachable. I averted my gaze and followed my friend into the bridal boutique. She tried on several dresses and finally settled on 2. Just as we were about to leave, she suddenly remembered something and insisted I try one on. When I stepped out of the fitting room, she held my hand and scrutinized me for a long time before asking, Olivia, have you ever thought about getting married? You're still young and so beautiful. Who wouldn't want to marry someone like you? I chuckled. I haven't thought about it yet. She sighed. How about I introduce you to someone? I know a few great guys. We can set up a time for you to meet them. I listened patiently, but her voice was soon interrupted by another. Sis-in-law. I turned around and saw Alex, Ethan's cousin. He'd always treated me with respect, one of the few who never brought up Sophia in front of me. His eyes lingered on me for a moment before he spoke again. Sorry, Olivia, force of habit. When did you get back? Are you here for an engagement or a wedding? Something this big, how come there wasn't even a hint of news? I opened my mouth to explain, but a store clerk approached and interrupted, addressing Alex. Sir, Mr. Joe is waiting for you outside. He asked you to hurry. I glanced out the window. Sure enough, there was a familiar figure standing with his back to us, his shirt sleeves casually rolled up as he spun his car keys in apparent boredom. Ethan and Alex had always been close, so it wasn't surprising they were here together. But it seemed Ethan had no intention of stepping inside, not even sparing the boutique a glance. Alex suddenly looked flustered. His gaze toward me became anxious. "I've got to go. Let's catch up later." Before I could respond, he hastily grabbed the hand of the woman beside him and hurried out the door. What I didn't expect was to come face to face with Ethan so soon. I was invited to attend a business summit. My seat was near the back. Halfway through, I noticed someone in the front row stand up and walk toward the stage. The man, dressed impeccably in a suit, glanced indifferently at the crowd before speaking in a calm, measured tone, as if nothing could stir his emotions. When he finished, the girl sitting beside me whispered, "He's so handsome. I heard he's still single, and there's no one special in his life." I was taken aback. He's still single. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, I looked up and caught Ethan's gaze freezing in place. The calm indifference he had worn just moments ago was gone. When it was over, I walked out, and there he was, standing by the door. Ethan's eyes were fixed on me, unflinching, unapologetic. There were too many people around. Instinctively, I turned to leave through another exit. Just then, my phone rang. It was Emma. "Are you free tomorrow?" she asked. "Come check out the venue I picked." I smiled faintly. "Your engagement venue? Sure, I'm free." I hung up after that. When I looked up again, Ethan was standing not far away, his gaze unusually cold and heavy. He looked at me, curved his lips into a faint smirk, and then, without a word, turned and walked away. That night, I had barely sat down at home when my phone lit up with a familiar number. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. It had been so long since we last spoke. Even seeing him earlier today had been purely accidental. Why was he calling now? Could something have happened? With that thought, I hesitated briefly before answering. The instant the call connected, I heard his voice on the other end, low, rough, tinged with a hint of drunkenness. He spoke directly, without preamble. Just 2 words, "Congratulations." I was silent for a moment, so Alex must have told him what happened that day. He thought I was getting engaged. I held the phone, unsure how to respond. I didn't feel like explaining that it had all been a misunderstanding, so I merely hummed in acknowledgement. Hearing that, he let out a short laugh. It was devoid of any real emotion, yet carried a faint edge of mockery. Before long, he hung up. When I pulled the phone away from my ear, I noticed the call duration displayed on the screen, 54 seconds. 2 sentences, nothing else. I set the phone down and went to take a shower. When I came back out, the phone was ringing incessantly. Walking over, I picked it up and glanced at the call log. In the span of just half an hour, Ethan had called me 11 times. I couldn't help but feel a little amused. He had always been so composed, as if nothing in the world could ruffle him. But now, here he was, calling me relentlessly over a dozen times. And just as I thought that, the phone rang again. I stared at it for a couple of seconds before answering. If I didn't, knowing him, I wouldn't be surprised if he showed up outside my apartment building next. "What do you want?" I asked. The line was silent for a long moment. I felt a flicker of frustration, mixed with something I couldn't quite name. Finally, I snapped, "You've been calling me all night. What exactly is it that you're after?" At last, he spoke. His voice was cold, deliberate, his words slow and measured. "Why didn't you answer earlier? Were you with someone? With your fiancé, perhaps?" 3 questions came at me in rapid succession. I froze, momentarily caught off guard. So that's what he thought, just because I hadn't picked up earlier. Pressing my lips together, I replied, my tone sharp with impatience. "What does it matter to you?" The sound of a lighter clicking came through the line. Then Ethan chuckled lightly. His tone was oddly serious, yet his words were slurred, almost indistinct. "Is he richer than me? Better to you than I was? Is that why you want to marry him? To be honest, those two questions weren't hard to answer. In North City, there weren't many people wealthier than Ethan. And during the 3 years we were together, he had been nothing short of impeccable. He always stood up for me, supported me unconditionally. Whenever I wanted to travel, all I needed to do was mention it to him. By the next day, everything would be arranged, down to the smallest detail. He never dismissed me, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything in response. On the other end of the line, Ethan was silent as well. After a long pause, he finally sighed. "You divorced me because of Sophia, didn't you?" he asked. "You didn't even bother to ask me what really happened. You just handed me your verdict. Olivia, what you did to me, it wasn't fair." At that moment, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but his voice seemed to quiver slightly. Realizing this, I felt a sudden wave of panic and instinctively hung up the call. I was almost certain Ethan had been drinking tonight. On any other day, he would never have acted like this. After I hung up, he didn't call again. But his outburst left me wide awake. I understood what Ethan was trying to say. He was apologizing, explaining that there was more to the story with Sophia, that there had been nothing between them. Our divorce, it seemed, had been my decision alone. But back then, I had been young, too stubborn to leave myself any room for doubt. I've always been a sensitive person, born the middle child with an older sister and a younger brother. My parents loved me, but their attention was never solely on me. They didn't intervene in my life much, either. When I was 12, I broke my dad's most beloved set of teaware. He said nothing. He simply turned around and bought a new set the next day. But when my sister made the same mistake a few days later, he laughed, playfully tapping her nose. "You never let anyone rest easy, do you?" I grew up trying to be careful, trying not to branch out too much, trying not to make mistakes. Later, when I married Ethan, and later still, when we divorced, I didn't want to trouble him either. I didn't dare tell him about the whispers I often overheard, people saying we weren't a good match. And as for Sophia, I never dared to ask him anything about her. By the time we divorced, I thought I was being selfless. Look at me, I thought. I'm such a considerate person, never asking, never probing, and now I'm stepping aside so he can be with his true love. How thoughtful of me. I'd convinced myself I wasn't worthy of asking such questions. Caught between pride and self-doubt, I became awkward and unlikable in the end. The next morning, I woke up early. When I went downstairs, I noticed a car parked not far from my building. I didn't recognize the car, but somehow, I felt I already knew who it belonged to. I walked over and glanced through the half-open window. There he was, Ethan. His eyes were closed, his head leaning back against the seat. His brows were slightly furrowed, his sleep restless. For a moment, he looked pitiable. It seemed he'd been here all night. I thought of the 13 missed calls from the night before. Pressing my lips together, I decided not to wake him. Instead, I left the neighborhood and managed to track down Alex's contact information. I called him. As soon as he answered, he greeted me with a cheerful sister-in-law. I paused, my voice catching for a second. I didn't bother correcting him. "How did you know it was me?" I asked. That stumped him. After a moment of awkward coughing, he explained. "About half a year ago, Ethan used my phone to call you. I saved your number in my contacts." I hadn't expected that answer. Half a year ago. I suddenly remembered. There had been such a call. I had been taking a nap when it came through, groggy and half awake. I thought it was the delivery person for a package I'd ordered. I said a few things offhandedly before hanging up. The person on the other end hadn't spoken, just quietly listened until, at the very end, they let out a faint hum. I remember thinking the voice sounded familiar, though I hadn't paid it much mind at the time. Now it was clear. It had been Ethan. Alex must have sensed my silence, so he added, "You know, he wanted to call you 2 years ago. He stared at your number for 2 whole years. Even I've memorized it by now, but he never worked up the courage to actually call." He paused and then laughed awkwardly. "In the end, half a year ago, I couldn't stand it anymore and dialed your number right in front of him. Couldn't work up the courage. It was hard to imagine someone as composed and calculating, as Ethan hesitating like that. I sighed softly, told Alex I understood, and asked him to come pick Ethan up. I didn't want him sleeping there much longer. If people started gathering, someone might snap a photo and post it online. Alex agreed immediately. "Got it, I'll be there soon." The next time I saw Ethan, it was several days later. That impulsive streak of his had passed. Now that he'd calmed down, he'd done his research and quickly discovered the truth. I didn't have a fiancé. The supposed engagement was nothing more than a fabrication. Alex called me to complain, saying he'd really messed up this time. Apparently, Ethan was so furious at him for spreading false rumors that he'd assigned Alex several difficult projects to handle. That evening, Ethan showed up at my door. Gone was the disheveled, weary man I'd seen before. He was composed now, exuding the quiet confidence I remembered. He looked at me with the same seriousness as before, his voice steady as he said, "Olivia." My heart tightened slightly. He stepped closer, lowering his gaze to meet mine. "I misunderstood before," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say." Only then did I finally lift my head to look at him. In the dim light of the hallway, his features were as striking as ever. He took another step closer, as if he had no way back, and said, almost recklessly, "Do you know, all these years I've missed you." I had never heard anything like this from him before. For a moment, I felt both angry and on the verge of tears. If only I'd heard those words sooner. Maybe things wouldn't have come to this. Maybe I would have realized that he did feel something for me, and maybe I wouldn't have walked away so resolutely. Strangely, I felt unexpectedly calm at that moment. I even had the presence of mind to think, what about Sophia? What was she to him? A golden couple, destined to end in regret? Ethan seemed to guess what I was thinking. His brows furrowed slightly as he said, "She's been remarried for a long time now." I stayed silent for a long time. Finally, I looked up at him and said, "None of that matters anymore." Even without Sophia, Ethan and I probably wouldn't have had a happy ending. As others had said, we were never really from the same world. I was always the one who didn't fit, the one who was his second choice. From the very beginning, it was a mistake. 16 after that day, I didn't see Ethan again. A few days later, our department went out for a gathering. Halfway through dinner, feeling suffocated, I stepped outside for a moment on my own. I hadn't expected to hear my name in the hallway. By now, who doesn't see it? The person Ethan cares about is Olivia. Who would have thought? I always believed he and Sophia were the perfect match. Someone sighed regretfully. Yeah, that Olivia. She comes from a less privileged background, for one. And let's be honest, she's always so distant and quiet around us. She doesn't fit in at all. But I guess that's just Ethan's type. Inside the room, their conversation continued. I had heard similar remarks countless times before. This time, though, they didn't stir even the faintest ripple in my heart. But in the next moment, a pair of hands covered my ears. A second later, those same hands pulled me behind him. Then, without hesitation, he kicked the door to the private room wide open. I stood there, stunned, staring at the man's back. He stood against the light, his expression dark and unreadable. Whether they're a match or not is none of your damn business. After saying that, he glanced at me and lightly gripped my wrist. Wait for me outside. I stood outside for only a moment before Ethan emerged. I asked, "Why are you here?" He looked at me, his gaze carrying something I couldn't quite decipher. "Just passing by." I let out a soft "oh" and didn't call him out on the lie. "What a coincidence, huh?" He sighed, his eyes settling on me. Suddenly, he asked, "Those 3 years, did you suffer a lot?" I froze for a moment, then shook my head. Not really. Back then, when we had free time, we'd sit together and watch movies. We'd talk about things that didn't really matter. But now, those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime. At this moment, if I had to describe what we were in 2 words, it would be estranged strangers. 17 not long after, I heard that Ethan had fallen out with the people from that private room. The incident caused quite a stir. People in our circle were saying that Ethan had stormed the gates in a fit of passion for his former love. That former love being his ex-wife. A few days later, I ran into Sophia. This time, she recognized me. She extended her hand for a handshake. "I've seen your wedding photos so many times. Honestly, I should have recognized you the first time we met." I was slightly taken aback. She smiled, a hint of wistfulness in her expression. "To be honest, I'm very jealous of you." I didn't quite understand. She looked at me, her gaze unfocused for a moment before she spoke. "Before he got married, everyone thought Ethan was in love with me. People said I was the kind of woman who belonged by his side. We seemed so perfectly matched." That year, in front of a crowd, I confessed my feelings to him. I told him we should give it a try. He didn't hesitate much before agreeing. He treated me well, truly well. But it didn't take long for me to realize that no matter how good he was to me, it wasn't love. He didn't love me. He never reached for my hand first. He didn't like it when I got too close to him. What she was telling me didn't quite align with what I had heard before. Sophia looked directly at me. So, in a fit of anger, I broke up with him. I yelled at him, saying he was the kind of person who would never understand love in his entire life. You know the rest. I married someone else out of spite. After my divorce, I got into a car accident. When he heard about it, he came to see me without a second thought. I thought he had finally figured it out, but after I came back, I realized it was just guilt. I glanced at the wedding ring on her hand, and now, she raised her hand, her expression radiant. "Don't worry. This time, I didn't marry anyone out of spite, but I do owe you an apology. For adding you on social media and sending you those things, it was selfish of me." I listened in silence until Sophia's gaze shifted to something behind me. She asked. I found the courage to start over. "What about you? How do you feel about Ethan?" I turned around and saw the man standing not far away. He looked at me, his expression uneasy, as if afraid that things between us would get even worse. Suddenly, I thought of that snowy night 2 years ago. I stood by the window, looking out. The figure I saw back then was almost certainly him. He walked toward me, instinctively explaining, "I was just here for a meeting. When I heard you were here, I came over." Memories of Ethan flooded my mind. I thought of the first time we met, when I sat nervously in front of him. He smiled, his handsome face lighting up as he said, "That day you accidentally spilled the sobering soup all over me. Do you remember?" "Hi, Olivia. We meet again." I thought of that night when rain poured in torrents, and he said to me, "Let's end this." The next day, he bought me a massive diamond ring, planning a second honeymoon trip to make up for what we'd lost. And later, when I brought up divorce, he sat on the sofa and said, "Take your time to think it over. I've got all the time in the world." Yeah, there's no such thing as pure black and white in this world. Like Ethan said, I shouldn't have been so quick to define our relationship. Compatible or not, who cares what others think? I laughed, tears welling in my eyes. "Ethan, you like me, don't you?" Ethan's side story. A different moonlit night when Ethan ended things with Sophia, he let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. For as long as he could remember, he had always downplayed love. To him, it wasn't worth losing sleep over, let alone the tears and laughter it seemed to evoke in others. But when he actually gave it a shot with Sophia, he couldn't shake the one thought that kept surfacing in his mind. This feels wrong. Later, he heard she got married. For a long time, it gnawed at him, not just for Sophia, but also for himself. He thought Sophia was crazy, but he also felt he'd let down a good woman who had genuinely cared for him. Maybe, just maybe, he shouldn't have started anything with her in the first place. That period of his life, to be honest, was a mess, until he met Olivia. She wasn't like any of the women he'd met before. She was stubborn, fiercely determined in everything she did. When he casually mentioned a shirt that had been ruined by a spilled hangover soup, the next time they met, she showed up with several similar-looking shirts in hand. She looked at him, a little embarrassed. "I couldn't remember exactly what it looked like, so I just bought a few. Do you want to check if any of these match?" In that moment, Ethan couldn't help but laugh. It was strange. Every time he saw her, he just wanted to smile. Back then, he thought, falling in love, even getting married. If it's with this woman in front of me, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. And as it turned out, things unfolded just the way he imagined. They had a long future ahead of them. Until the day news came that Sophia had been in a car accident. It wasn't anything too serious. But still, out of a lingering sense of guilt, he went to see her. And in doing so, he forgot Olivia was waiting for him. Years later, that became the one thing he regretted the most. But at the time, it didn't even cross his mind. He came home as usual, ready to explain everything to her. But when he saw her, she didn't seem willing to listen. She said she wanted a divorce. She said she was tired. Her words hit him like a blade, tearing into his heart. Tired? How could she be tired? After she left, Ethan secretly tried to find her many times. He flew back and forth, the plane tickets piling up in a thick stack on his desk. He wasn't an idiot, but when it came to this, he couldn't help but be utterly clueless. In the spring of the second year after she left, Sophia got married. She came clean to Ethan, admitting that she had once added Olivia on WeChat. It was only then that Ethan had a moment of clarity, as if a bucket of cold water had been dumped over his head. It wasn't that Olivia had grown tired. She had simply given up on him. There's no such thing as a secret that can stay hidden forever. Neglecting her had been his fault. Countless nights he thought about rushing to her to explain everything properly. But every time, he lacked just a little bit of courage. It's surprising, isn't it? He had always thought of himself as invincible, and yet, in the end, he turned out to be nothing but a coward. Still, the years ahead were long. He had time to make things right, slowly but surely.